All right, hello students. This is going to be our first flipped classroom video for Unit 2. If you have the 5th edition, the brief edition of Foner, that's pages 43 through 51. If you don't have those editions, you can follow along by the subject headings, The Coming of the English and the Settling of the Chesapeake. So let's get started. A couple of these things actually were in a previous reading that I had to skip over, so we didn't have to read too many pages. So you didn't read about the enclosure movement, but that is an important push factor for migration into the Americas. So just briefly, the enclosure movement was by no means new, but it was something that expanded pretty dramatically during the Tudor England period, and that was from the late 15th century to the early 17th century. So essentially what it was an enclosing of previously common farmland. Often the land used to be open for people to graze their cattle in a common space. But over time, the landlords, people that actually owned that land, started to fence it in. And so if you were a tenant farmer and you relied on that land to do things like graze your cattle, you suddenly had no place to do that. Gradually, this actually forced tenant farmers out of this land entirely, and they were forced to continue to make a living, to move to the cities in search of new jobs. And this led to great overpopulation, urban poverty, and we're going to look at that a little bit more with the primary document analysis in class. Another thing, I talked about Tudor England. There's a lot of political instability in England during this period. In 1603, Queen Elizabeth I died, and she did not have any children, so she did not produce an heir. And so that's marked the start of a new dynasty in England called the Stuart dynasty. And King James I, the first of the Stuart monarchs, actually was not English at all. He was Scottish. And so there are a lot of English people that feel out of place in this new kingdom, and there's a lot of religious underpinnings there too, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And so that's another factor to cause a lot of people to want to leave England entirely. A pull factor would be something called, oh, and I forgot to talk about, I didn't have any notes on this, but I just realized I had a picture of this. There's also a factor called primogeniture, which wasn't talked about in the reading, but essentially there was an inheritance practice that was very common in England, where only the firstborn son inherited any property. So if you were the second-born, you basically were out of luck. You did not inherit any land. So there were a lot of people who were second or third or fourth born that wanted to leave as well because they didn't really have prospects to own land, and primogeniture was something that did not extend into the American colonies. Okay, moving on to indentured servitude now. So this was a pull factor for many poorer people from England and other parts of Europe, particularly Ireland, where they were essentially subjects of England anyway. So essentially, indentured servants, they were technically voluntary servants. They made up actually 2/3 of the population of the 17th century English settlers. So that's a huge proportion of the population. Indentured servants were too poor to come to the Americas on their own. And so in order to pay for their passage over to the Americas, they entered into a period of servitude from a period between 5 to 7 years. And their owners would pay for them to come over to the Americas. If they survived their tenure, they were paid what's called freedom dues, so a small sum of money, and they ideally would use that money to pay for land, but oftentimes they weren't either able to afford that, or actually many of them, because the conditions of their work were very harsh, did not actually survive their period of servitude. And they did not have some of the basic freedoms that non-servants had in the American colonies. For example, they did not have the right to marry, and they didn't have freedom of movement, right? They were bound to a contract to their employer, or actually effectively to their owner. And so this was a rather harsh way of living. And also because many of the indentured servants were illiterate, they could have modifications to their contract which actually extended their period of servitude. I want us to briefly look at some of the motives for colonization and potentially compare them to some of the Spanish motivations for exploration and conquest that we talked about in Unit 1. So let's look at gold, glory, and God really briefly again. So for gold, this sort of varies. There was clearly a desire among some early colonists for riches. The majority of the earliest settlers to Jamestown, who we'll talk about more in a minute, were young single men, and they didn't have a lot to lose, and they did hope to make a fortune. Many of them really were focused more on trying to gain riches than to do things very basic, like to feed themselves. And this is one of the reasons why the starving time from 1609 to 1610 was such an issue in colonial Jamestown. Again, we'll talk about that more in a second. Glory. This was a slightly less nationalistic motivation for colonization among the English. Again, we already talked about the political instability in England, so not everyone who's moving from England to the colonies really feels a tight bond to their crown at this period. In fact, many people are fleeing it. But there was a quest for individual glory still among some. Some of the earliest settlements were actually funded by private joint stock companies that were funded by stockholders. And so individuals hoped to make a fortune by investing in the colonies. So that could be seen as a form of glory. God, that was important among some. There was a lot of religious uncertainty in England. In the previous unit, I had a brief talk about the English Reformation in one of the videos. In New England and in the Quaker areas of the Mid-Atlantic, like Pennsylvania, there was certainly a desire for religious freedom. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we talk about New England in detail. So let's move on to Jamestown, because that's what you read about for last night. Okay, so first, the really important thing to think about is who were the first settlers and what were they looking for. Foner has a quote describing them as a quarrelsome band of gentlemen and servants. That suggests that they were not particularly organized in the earliest years of Jamestown's settlement. They were much more concerned with individual opportunity, particularly economic opportunity. They were also very much looking for land, cheap, available land. Think, England is not a particularly large space. It is an island, and with things like primogeniture, which I already talked about, many people did not really have the prospect of getting land at all. And so if you were able to afford to pay for an indentured servant, then you could gain a vast amount of land in the Americas. The head rate system, which was essentially a system that gave land to people that were able to pay for indentured servants, was what laid the foundation in many ways for the plantation agricultural system in the American South. So people who could pay for indentured servants could get up to 50 acres of land per indentured servant, or they got a right of land per head. Okay, that's why they called it the head right system. Head meaning a person, right of land. Hope that makes sense. Another thing that's important for us to realize, I already talked about the individual gain that many of these early settlers were looking for. They wanted things like gold. They wanted to be able to get rich quickly. And so many of the original settlers, if they were gentlemen, right, people that found them, that identified with a more elite class, they didn't want to do things like farm. Okay, so more than half of the original settlers who remained after the first winter, I misspoke there. The first two winters, we did see the population of Jamestown reduced by approximately half. But the worst winter for Jamestown was from 1609 to 1610. The population of Jamestown going into the winter of 1609 was about 500. By the end of that winter, there were only 60 settlers left, which is just crazy to think about. And again, that was due to their inability to organize a farming system, and their inability to be able to work with the Powhatan Indians that lived surrounding them, because the Jamestown area had a bountiful supply of food. So if they were able to potentially have a more peaceful trading system with the Powhatan people, they probably would have survived this winter in greater numbers. In fact, during the starving times, some of the settlers actually decided to flee Jamestown and take refuge with the Powhatan people instead. So let's talk about their relationship with the Powhatan. So there was actually a war between the Powhatan people and the Jamestown settlers in this early period as well. It was called the First Anglo-Powhatan War. I think it was from 1609 to 1613, if I remember. And it was finally resolved with a very tenuous peace agreement. And that peace agreement was actually a marriage. It was between Pocahontas, the daughter of Powhatan, and John Rolfe. Not John Smith, for those of you who watch Disney. I'm sorry to spoil that sort of childhood memory there. But this, we saw this in Europe all the time too, right? Marriages were not for love, they were for political alliances. So after this marriage, this was a hope that the Powhatan people and the Jamestown settlers could live in harmony, which lasted not particularly long, less than 10 years. And we'll talk about the uprising of 1622 in just a minute here. The other reason why Jamestown actually survived was when people died in the settlement, more people came to replace them. And so Jamestown was still heavily advertised to potential settlers in England, and many of them, particularly once the tobacco cultivation went underway and began to see some success, more settlers kept pouring in. So the population was able to continue to sustain itself despite some of the rough winters in their early years. Another really important reason why Jamestown survived was because of the organization that John Smith brought to it. John Smith actually forced settlers who previously were unwilling to farm to work. Otherwise, they were not given a share of the harvest. One thing I neglected to say about Pocahontas, which is important, after her marriage to John Rolfe, she was actually sent to England with him, and she was put on display as sort of an exotic figure to represent the Powhatan people, and she ended up dying of disease while she was in England, and she never returned to her home. So it's important for us to realize that even with this marriage as a political alliance, that did not necessarily, at least from the perspective of the English, mean that they saw themselves as equals. I'm realizing that this video might be getting a little bit longer, so how about you take a quick brain break, and then I'll talk about the tenuous relationship between Jamestown and indigenous people in the region, and I'll also talk about moving forward, how Jamestown continued to see some success. So stay tuned for part 2. Thanks, guys.